Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. In 1622, Diego Velázquez moved from Seville to Madrid with a letter of introduction to the king's chaplain, himself also a Sevillano. After a few years and multiple demonstrations of his unmatched talents, the painter had secured admission to royal service, in which he would remain for the rest of his life. Relatively little is known about the man Velázquez was, and many of his celebrated works have been lost, a fact that has rendered the figure of the artist almost as enigmatic as the groundbreaking works he produced. In Painter to the King, Amy Sackville plunges readers into the dark corridors of the Spanish court, into the life and practice of the artist himself, not that the two are really separable, and behind the series of locked doors that serve to seal King Felipe off from the world. Composed with a touch that is both formidably assured and yet exquisitely light, and seamlessly combining extensive historical research, meticulous observation of Velázquez's works, and a consummate exercise of authorial imagination, Amy Sackville's Painter to the King is not a work that one simply reads or even absorbs, but which one experiences, from the gestures of the artist at work to the mental anguish of the painter, as well as the master he serves. Amy Sackville was born in Plymouth in 1981. She has degrees from Leeds, Exeter College, Oxford and Goldsmiths. Her first novel, The Still Point, was longlisted for the Orange Prize and won the John Llewellyn Rhys Prize, and her second, Orkney, won the Somerset Maugham Award. She lives in London. The Guardian wrote that, in Painter to the King, Sackville has written one of the finest historical novels of recent years. Writer Porrick O'Donnell declared, Sackville achieves an almost miraculous intimacy with her subject. Painter to the King is the most engrossing fictional study of visual art I've ever encountered. Well, the Times simply called it superb. Please join me in welcoming Amy Sackville to Shakespeare and Company. So, to begin, before we hear a little bit from the book, I'd like to talk about, about the origins of the project. So your first two books, The Still Point and Orkney, in a sense, and I don't mean this sort of emotionally, but they're quite cold books in a way. I mean, one of them takes place in the Antarctic?
Arctic.
In the Arctic. Mm-hmm. And the other one takes place in Orkney. Mm-hmm. And yet this one is really sort of based in kind of the torrid atmosphere of Madrid. And I was just wondering, to begin, what drew you to this atmosphere? Was it sort of looking for a contrast to what you've been writing before?
It's a good question. I do tend to start with place, and I think I had an idea of... I hadn't intended to write a book that was set in a kind of factual, historical context. I had an idea that I wanted to write a book about a kind of Mediterranean court of the kind that was invented by Jacobean playwrights. So this idea of a kind of complex, labyrinthine, sophisticated world, which you would find in Webster, in the Duchess of Malfi, that's that sort of text. And so I thought I would go to Madrid because I wanted to write about a court painter. I thought that would be an interesting perspective on that kind of world. And then when I started doing research into different artists, different court painters, found that not only the work of Velázquez, but actually his life story was really kind of compelling because he was so embedded in that world for such a long time, and because, as you said in your very kind introduction, he's kind of an absence in that, in a way. He's quite a sort of unknown figure. So I was sort of drawn to it almost accidentally by going to Madrid and finding him there. Because,
of course, The Still Point, again, it sort of draws on sort of a little bit on the sort of the Shackleton expeditions and things like that, but it sort of, it explicitly fictionalizes them. And so what convinced you to then make this leap into fact? Was it sort of, it seems in a way something that an author might find quite constraining in a way?
It was terribly constraining, and it was a decision that I continued to question throughout the process of composing the book, which took quite a long time, partly for that reason. I think that I kept coming back to the kind of historical record and feeling that I couldn't make something up because I know that this happened there, in a way that quite sort of small incidents that the average reader or the common reader wouldn't know was the case or not. That, you know, the king was ill in this year and therefore I can't put this scene here instead of there, and trying to convince myself all the time that some of those things don't really matter. And one of the ways to do that was to not ever use the word Velázquez in the book itself. He's never named. So I'm which, you know, it clearly is about him, but it's a way of sort of trying to keep one step remove or distance.
And of course, I guess there must have been something particularly compelling about the figure of Velázquez in that case.
Yeah, so he was, I think looking back, he was the model, he was the reason I thought a court painter would be a useful sort of central figure in the first place. That he is someone who has access to every level of that court, so he has a sort of intimacy with the king, but he also has access all the way down to the kind of entertainers and jesters, and the kind, he has a tremendous compassion for all of those subjects, and I think that's what I found very compelling about his work. So I think in terms of the kind of stylistic or the structural reason to use him, that was always there, and it was really when I found out about the biography that I thought, and also the biography of Philip IV, which I knew nothing about. They just seemed like such a sort of tragic figure that it's kind of irresistible.
There is something fascinating about that role, in a way, of being the painter to the king. And as I was reading, I was trying to think if there is a kind of a contemporary equivalent. And I was discussing, one of my colleagues suggested, okay, it's a fictional equivalent, but a character from House of Cards who is the kind of, he's brought in to write the sort of speeches. Tom indeed. And of course there are sort of official photographers of presidents, but they don't seem to have quite the sort of access, and of course because of the democratic process, quite the sort of duration of relationship that Velázquez would have had with King Philip.
I think to me that's what was so interesting about him, is this intensity and intimacy that they know each other for 40 years. He's appointed, I think this was one of the things that perhaps drew me to him specifically, that at the point at which he was appointed, he was told, you are the only person that's allowed to paint the king from now on. So he's given this kind of privilege, and I think it is he's a sort of image maker. Essentially, he's responsible for the PR. He's responsible for the image of the king that will be put out into the world. So he designs the original, and his studio will be making copies of that, and it's sent out where that image is necessary.
And yet at the same time, he's responsible for the image, and yet he, at least the Velázquez we meet in Painter to the King, is not somebody who will necessarily give in to aesthetic demands of his subjects. I mean, there's a moment where you write, he won't flatter, he can't lie. And that seems, again, quite an unusual thing from a contemporary perspective. So when you have an official photographer, you can imagine that at least they'll go through the photos and they'll decide, okay, not this one, not that one. Whereas he seemed to have a sort of artistic liberty to shape the king's image as he wished.
I think there's something that's really fascinating to me, is that almost because of that relationship, almost all we have as a record of his image is what Velázquez painted. It is on record that one of the reasons that Philip IV and his sort of coterie were attracted to Velázquez is for that reputation as a kind of realism, that he didn't paint things just to the form or the structure that was kind of just a repetition of the same image, that he was trying to paint a genuine portrait.
Which in a way seems to say quite a lot about the king as well, that would choose such a painter.
And I think he did. I think one of the reasons I find him quite a tragic figure is that he loved art, he loved culture, he sort of ended up being the ruler of this country that is involved in endless wars and conflicts and depressions, and I sort of have this sense that, you know, he had his own key to Velázquez's studio, and he would sort of just let him in and just sit in the corner and watch him, and that seems like such a kind of extraordinary thing to me, that it was a way for him to just sit and be quiet and enjoy a thing that he enjoyed.
It's sort of there's also a moment where, and this was something that really struck me, at a moment you just write, the painter listens. So he's painting a portrait of Felipe, and you said the painter listens, and of course I think one of the reasons it struck me is because listening is not necessarily a quality one might associate with a practitioner of the visual arts, you know, and yet there seems to be as much the role of counselor in the modern sense of the term. Like, he was there not necessarily to advise, or in fact probably explicitly not to advise, but to provide a sort of a sympathetic ear to this king.
Yes, and that's something. I'm coming back to the previous question about feeling constrained by the history, or how much I feel able to invent. So I know this fact about the key and about him coming into the studio. There's not very much to know about what that relationship was actually like, but I sort of liked the idea that it was a space in which they were sort of just two people who liked art, and where he could just speak. And because what is on record about Velázquez's personality is that he was reserved, that he was very well mannered, that he was very courtly. So you kind of imagine him being almost a safe sounding board.
I'd like to come back to the relationship in a little while, but since you've mentioned the research, I'm fascinated to hear a little bit more about that, because one of the things that really struck me while reading the book is, firstly, how sort of unlike a lot of historical fiction it is, in as much as sort of a lot of historical fiction wears its research very heavily on its sleeve, so it's happy to point out certain facts and little things the author knows, and little things the author has discovered, and that's not at all what you do in Painter to the King. And you sort of any, let's say, nuggets of information one might discover are there in service of the novel, rather than to show off the level of research that you've done.
I'm glad you said that.
But one thing that also struck me was how steeped in Velázquez's paintings the story is as well. Sort of, they almost lend a narrative structure to the story, and I'm just intrigued with your relationship with this art. Actually, sort of how you came across it, and how it sort of overtook you to become this book.
Thank you for saying that. I think the art and the paintings were always very, very early on. As I was thinking about the book, I knew that would be a kind of structural principle. So, and a kind of formal template, if you like. So I really liked the idea that of trying to find a way for the writing itself to engage with and mimic or emulate the style of the painting. So when he starts out, he's very realist, he's very precise, he includes these sort of very odd, sort of exact still life elements, and as his confidence progresses, or as he becomes more assured, the brushwork becomes much looser and more fragmentary and more impressionistic, and so I kind of wanted to find is there a way with language to kind of emulate that way of using gesture, I suppose.
I wonder if now might be a good moment to hear the first extract, because it's sort of in a sense it's concerned with the relationship of the art to the writing.
Yes. So this is the very opening of the book, which sort of describes the moment that I've been describing, of going to Madrid, thinking I'll do some general research, and seeing this work and thinking, oh no, actually I'll do that. So the first chapter is titled Frame. Okay. It opens out from this dark corner, halfway along this corridor, and there's the door. Distracted by something, perhaps, looking at something on the opposite wall, or at someone else, or the floor plan, or my own tired feet, I pass or almost pass it, but then the eye just catches and I double take and stop. Step forward to the archway and aside to just off-centre, letting people pass, buffeted by bodies. I don't see them. I see, opposite, a man is also pausing in a doorway, and everything's stopped. Between us, on my side of the frame, the buzz and brightness of the gallery, and on his a cool grey room, lofty, quiet, dim in its high and far corners. Both of us at a threshold, and the threshold of the frame between. And they are all there, all long familiar. I've been half seeking them, and yet this shock. There they all are, just as if they always have been, or have just this moment stopped, looking back. And just off-centre, just looking, he has just stepped back. He's also just stopped. The painter, there he is with his long brush, and I I want to pass through this archway I'm stopped in and cross the gallery and step through the frame and into the whole room beyond it, find my way through and between them, their heads all turning to watch me pass or else still staring out as I move, invisible among them. Pause and stand at the painter's shoulder and find out at last what he's painting, what's on the surface of the canvas, the reverse of that vast, framed blank back, what he and only he can see. Pause to look and then leave him to it and find my way all the way back to that door at the back, squeeze past the silhouette man on the stair and see what's beyond in the yellow light, which might be sunshine or lamplight. So I step towards him across the gallery until the gallery vanishes and all the people in it and the frame closes around my peripheral vision, and I stand on the brink of the light and regard them. The sinuous line of them and how they might easily at any moment join hands and dance a jig. From the girl on the left offering a red beaker to the girl about to take it, through gesture and curtsy and bow to the poised balancing hands of the delicate dwarf on the right, who is distracted by the dog and seems already to be dancing. And motionless, held here, I dance back across the restless, unresolved cadence of it. From hand to hand, from corner to corner, pointed toe to poised brush, elbow crook to elbow crook. It is a strange, cut-off light that lights them, bright lines in the depths, frame to frame to frame. The mirror just off-centre on the back wall is full of that borrowed light. He is interested in mirrors, this painter. I live in a world of them. I want to tell him. Cameras, phones, chrome, shop windows, plate glass, screens of all sizes, reflections everywhere. I can't get away from myself. What would you make of that? But look how real, in contrast, this illusion he has made. How true to a life that is itself illusion, nothing more, but not less either. Shadows and shams. A life lived as a dream that repeats and retreats and refracts through successions of sometimes impossible frames. I was, but also at the same time I was there and also watching, but then again, step closer, and it's all just a surface of smears. Rough daubs, features half-formed, hands that only gesture at the shape of hands. The painter's brush has a long handle made only of a swipe of that same brush, and so stepping back, stopped, he sees clearly the illusion of coherence he is bringing into being. It is also the whole life of the painter. Your whole life, Diego, or some semblance of it, a version, a way to say, to frame it. And at the centre, there in the dimness of a vanishing point, it is an open door. And I pause on the threshold unseen, about to leave or to enter, longing across this distance, dying to go towards it, to move towards you, and I can't move, quite. This wasn't going to be about you, but now, this, it turns out, you are what I was looking for in this hot foreign city. And I've stopped here, and everything's stopped. It feels like hours, and every minute passing increases that impossible distance of centuries, of years, of yards. And from now on, from this moment on, I am always following, always trying to follow. I go out back into the city, and it's been hours, and already it's evening, and still light, and still hot. I order Fino and sit, and I'm still there, just stopped. Just to find a way to say it.
Thank you. I guess when we find sort of a fictionalization of historical events, often in novels, there's a kind of assumed pact, I guess, between the reader and the writer. That sort of, okay, some of the stuff is going to be made up, some of it's not going to be, some of it's going to be sort of a liberal interpretation of the facts, and we don't normally get this kind of explicit representation of the writer struggling with this fact of sort of in the extract you read of sort of the beginning of the engagement with the subject, and this is a voice which is not in any way sort of a large part of the book, but does come back at sort of punctual moments. And I'm just intrigued to hear a little bit more about why you decided, in a sense, to go one step further than assuming the reader would give you this liberty, and actually to put this kind of authorial voice in the book.
I think it's probably a fairly complicated answer to that. One part of which is that it just happened, and that it was a kind of instinctual decision, and I think that's often how I write, that something comes out and then I kind of interrogate why it's come out and decide whether I want to keep it or not. I think it's partly that discomfort with invention and or with the idea of taking something that happened and taking that liberty, and wanting to acknowledge that there's an artifice in it. But I think also it has to do with that engagement with the aesthetic of the period that I'm writing about, which is obsessed with artifice and the acknowledgement of artifice. And the painting, which, as I'm sure most of you recognise as being described, Las Mañanas, is kind of very complicated in the way that it engages the gaze and throws your gaze around it, and he is present there. So I think that idea of including the presence of the creator also comes from that as a sort of model. If that makes sense.
It also allows you, I think, to deal with something which I think is sort of, it's present throughout the book, but is not always brought to the forefront. Is, I guess, the relationship between a writer and a visual artist. I mean, I wondered sometimes when reading it if there was a certain envy from the writer towards the visual artist, of a certain, I don't know, necessarily a freedom that they might have, or I don't know, envying the kind of the containment provided by the canvas or something like that. But I was just wondering about your personal relationship with visual arts. Like, is this something which you sort of has concerned you for a long time, this sort of the contrast between the two disciplines?
So yeah, it's a good question. I have always been very interested in the visual. I think I'm interested in the difficulty of language, or the necessity of articulation. And so I suppose in that sense, yes, there's an envy of putting something out into the world that isn't made of words, and that people can choose to respond to verbally or not verbally. Whereas there's something very sort of literal and about the verbal. So yes, I think maybe there is a sort of enviousness and an interest in what the gap between those two modes is. And
also it's just quite a challenge as well, I think, sort of trying to get firstly, like, just to describe a painting in any way that sort of can evoke what the painting can do, because as you just said, it's sort of a painting can have an effect on a non-verbal level. So trying to figure out exactly how to describe it, perhaps reproduce the effect as well, and then also describing the painter's process as well, sort of like the gestures, just the way the brush moves across the canvas. And one of the ways you do this in the book is again playing, I guess, with a sort of a visual element, with the use of dashes, with the use of space, and again, this is something which you've sort of done a little bit before in different ways. So in Orkney, you played a little bit with the use of blank space on the page, and so I'm just curious, did you always know that when you were going to be writing about a painter that you would have to use some sort of, I don't want to sort of say visual trickery, because that makes it sound a little too contrived, but those kind of techniques, or was it something again which came out in the writing?
I think sort of both. I think there's always a kind of experimental beginning to the writing where I'm not making a commitment to it necessarily being included in the book, but I think those dashes came out quite early on in that process. And I am interested in what text looks like on the page, and what that does to your experience of reading before you get to the words themselves. So the dashes were being used in quite a sort of cavalier way as a sort of where it felt like there was a gap or a space or a pause, and then became obsessively regulated in the final editorial stages, where I worked out what the system was for each of those different types of dashes, which you don't need to know in order to understand the book, but was necessary for me to know what the rule was to make them work.
And you don't have to tell us what the rule is, but did it surprise you? Was there kind of a sort of an articulated a system there before you were able to articulate it?
I think
yourself?
there probably was, yes. I think that actually, having worked out the system and going back to edit, there weren't that many occasions where I thought, oh no, that's wrong. I'd done it accidentally and then had to figure out what it was that I was doing.
There's a really sort of enigmatic epigraph to the book, which I don't want to necessarily ask you to pronounce upon, but at this stage in the conversation, I just think it's interesting to bring up. Is so it's one from Balthazar Gracian, which are sort of words of the shadows of deeds, the former female, the latter male. I don't know if I particularly have a question about it, but I just I was just wondering if you had any thoughts particularly you wanted to express about that. I guess particularly a female writer writing about a male painter.
Yeah, so I'm a huge fan of the epigraph and of the enigmatic epigraph. I'm really interested in the way that sets up, that creates a paratext that sets up a gap between the text itself and what someone else has written, and the fact that I am utilising that fragment. So the epigraph comes from a book called The Pocket Oracle by Baltasar Gracian, which is more or less contemporary to the book, and which is sort of like a Spanish Machiavelli. It's a sort of guide to how to be an individual, and particularly how to be a public individual, how to be a courtier, that kind of thing. And it's full of these little aphorisms. And I just found it quite funny to use. I think partly is just that idea that it is a very masculine book, perhaps, that most of the major players are male. And perhaps it comes back also to your question about painting and writing, that the idea that painting is an act and that words are sort of after the fact. So I think I like the idea that it raises questions and that you are invited to ask how this might apply. Because clearly in Gracian's formulation, it's a binary and it's a hierarchical binary.
And also, I mean, there's kind of this hierarchy is represented in the book as well a little bit, but almost, I guess, almost the reverse of it, in as much as one of the, I don't know if it's necessarily could be described as one of his motivations, Diego's motivations, but is the sort of like poets are made knights, in a way that painters weren't. Sort of painters, they have more of this sort of, you talked about the fact they have access to different levels of the court, and they're almost considered artisans in a way that sort of the poets are not. So there's sort of the nobility of the practice that way is almost reversed.
So and that was almost one of the things that I wanted to resist as the driving narrative, this idea that he is seeking entitlement. But that is true of the period, that there's a debate going on about poetry is a kind of noble art, whereas painting isn't, because you work with your hands and then you sell the thing that you made with your hands. So it is equated with the artisan. So his argument, when he is eventually, spoiler alert, when he is eventually knighted, is to make this argument that, I never exactly sold the thing that I'd made, but also that's partly what Las Meninas is about, is this he's not quite touching the canvas, so you see him thinking, not painting.
That's one of the things when I guess a book is based on historical facts, is you don't need spoiler alerts. And we're going to come, because I'd like to talk a little bit more about the king at this moment, because I suppose maybe naively looking back, but I was quite surprised by how much time we spend with the king during the book, and it was only after finishing that I realised that obviously the painter to the king is the role that Diego occupied, but also there seemed to be this thing, it almost seemed like it could be extracted from sort of a dialogue, sort of, said the painter to the king, ... said the king to the painter. So there's this kind of back and forth, and this is just a fascinating character, this king. So as you said, sort of very, very sort of passionate about art. Also in his personal life, desperate for a son, and utterly convinced that his youthful indiscretions, that he's being punished for his youthful indiscretions by the lack of a son, in fact.
Yes.
So I'd just like to hear a little bit more about your relationship, not so much with the painter, but with the character of the king.
I think you're right that when I'd first conceived of this book that would centre around a court painter, I had the idea that it would be quite a sprawling book, and it would have lots of little narratives that knit together about lots of different members of the court. And actually, having found this basis in fact, the king became a much more kind of dominant figure, and is, I suppose in traditional terms, much more developed as a character. We learn a lot more about him. But he is just it's just such a kind of sad figure in history, that he's sort of subject to these this kind of irrepressible urge. He's expected to produce an heir. He's very constrained in his choice of people that with which he might, or with whom he might do so. So it's kind of a process of diminishing returns for him, really. Yeah. And he is sort of on the one hand quite profligate, on the other hand absolutely kind of pious and absolutely convinced that his sins are being visited not only on himself and on his wife but on the whole of Spain. So, and people just keep dying around him. He has to marry the person that his son was supposed to marry because his son's died, who was also his niece. So it's just this kind of terrible, messy thing.
And also, I mean, I suppose this is a slightly sort of banal observation in a way, but like one thing that really struck me was just how public a life the king lived. So he sort of, you know, I mentioned in the introduction that he lived behind these kind of series of locked doors, which was the case, and yet he's being witnessed at sort of almost every moment of his existence. There's, I think, just one moment that really brought this home, where you write, the king dined alone. Yeah. You know, so he is eating his meal alone, and yet he is surrounded by a sort of, you know, people to serve him, people to carve his meat, and even in the sort of in the marital bed, there are people there to check that the act has gone to completion, and I just thought that was just a really interesting experience, coupled with the experience of being observed by a painter in a way. And I just thought, and that's one of the sort of things which I think the book plays off against each other very well, is a sort of like, there's a difference between being witnessed and being observed, and perhaps being seen as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that there's one of the things I found interesting about the Spanish court and culture, which I sort of didn't really know before I started researching this, is that it's quite separate from the rest of Europe. So in contrast to the way the French court operates, which is all public show, so they would dine all together, and that would be a much more sort of communal thing, whereas because of this piety and this kind of formality, everything is so sort of strictly regulated. Everything he does has a form to it and a pattern to it. And so I think you're right that idea that he's constantly performing himself, and maybe that goes back to the reason that maybe he was attracted to the idea of employing a painter who painted the person that he was and not just that role. Although towards the end of his life, and again this is one of the bits of evidence that you can build the whole narrative on, he writes, I'm sick of sitting for my portrait, and just this kind of, Velázquez is so phlegmatic, that's the word he uses about him, that he's just kind of doggedly representing me getting older and older, until eventually he's kind of like, actually, I'm done. So that's, there's something very sad about that, I think.
I guess also there's this sense of sort of maybe his kind of profligacy is also connected to the sort of the regimented nature of the life he's been forced into. Almost this kind of, there's been this sort of a build-up of pressure, and then there are moments when he has to let off steam. And I think it might be a good moment to hear the second reading we talked about, which is very much a letting off of steam in the book.
Yes, so this is Carnival, which obviously traditionally is the moment of things being upended, things being subverted, fools being given license, and so this is a moment where the court goes out into the city, where most of the time they spend their time quite sort of sequestered, while essentially living it up while the country is going to ruin. So this is a moment where they come out into the streets, and is Corpus Christi, is the time of Carnival. So this is the end of their partying within the castle. So Here is a hidden chamber in the back wall of the stage, opening to show the true King Segismundo, kept captive as a madman and brought forth from his tower to govern as a ploy. And then he is told, it's only a dream, life is a dream, you've only dreamed you were king. But it's too late. The veil is rent. The dream is no less true than the waking nightmare, and the rightful lunatic has already taken over the asylum. All somehow comes right in the end. Of fools we find in Ecclesiastes, the number is infinite, and Democritus tells us that the same is true of worlds. One can't help but wonder if the first of these infinities is concentrated here in our own instance of the latter. And as St. Paul says, we must become foolish in order to become wise. And so another summer advances, and Publius leads the men of pleasure out to dance into the streets for Corpus Christi, and we are all men of pleasure for this festival. Here's the king riding out of the palace gates, upright and indulgent upon his horse among his people, out from the Alcazar through the streets of the city, dancing in motley behind friars in their hundreds, bearing gold and silver effigies, dancing behind the effigies and before the king and his councillors, bearing the host, bearing the body of Christ through the streets of the city in grand celebration of the flesh, revelling. The bright, lolling, paced heads of dwarves and giants behind them, outsize, foreheads nodding as the necks within them roll and hold them just about upright, dancing. The nodding foreheads shine with a sweat of egg glaze as the heads within sweat into the damp smell of paper and plaster and glue, peering out through the teeth of a grin or a grimace. Behind them the spine of the serpent winds through the streets, each articulation with its own set of legs poking out from the pasteboard body, and trundled on wheels to bear its great weight, each part a-glitter with its splendid scales. Its eyes ablaze with coloured foils and firecrackers, its teeth flash in the sun, its 3 tongues flick and lash at the ends of their levers, it flicks off hats with its tail in passing, the peasants who've come up from the country open-mouthed, gasping, they yelp as it slithers through the dumb show streets, and the city kids mimic and gape and howl at these rustics and fall about laughing. The nobles applaud from their horses. Tricks and illusions faint and vanish and snap. The puff of sulphurous stink bombs flung at and out of windows. The dandies toss gilded, painted eggs in at the windows of carriages, and the ladies cry out at the splash, but it's rose-perfumed water that splashes their skirts, and they're pleased to disdain it haughtily, a day's ordinary wages dissipating with each puff of perfume. A boy in a monkey mask ties a wire across a narrow alley and hoots as his victims dance into his trap in a tangle of goats and ganders, of beaks and feathers and horns. And we process past the plays the abject madmen put on, their faces painted with ochre, cheeks daubed red and yellow, the yellow whites of their wide eyes, hair and habits shorn and washed where possible for the occasion. They pace out their motions, meticulous, spasmodic, jerkily, endlessly slowly, distractedly, wandering, in agitation, in their white clothes and their white mouths hanging or muttering, their eyes wide or weeping or half-closed contented in the sunshine, their arms flailing or hugging or grasping or carefully remembering the motions. They stretch out in appeal to the King, or to Christ, to the body of Christ that has been in their mouths, the blood of Christ that has touched their tongues, or to no one, no king or god or world beyond the circle of their own arms, alone and gathered only into themselves and indifferent, weary, narcoleptic, eyes swollen with slumber or peeled back raw and haunted with the effort of endless waking, the refusal night after night of nightmares, gathering arms which they receive graciously and hide away among their habits, or toss aside forgetting for others to pick up and push between tight-closed lips. Their attendants gather and shepherd their flock and keep them in line. They are God's children. They are not to be mocked or feared or chastised. They are unconstrained by prudence or propriety. They are free to live each in their own world of irrational wonders, which is also maybe the world of the miracle, maybe closer to God. It's a frightening liberty. This the king sees, although he might envy it. They are tabulated and categorized. There are so many ways to be mad. The simple, the deranged, the innocent, delirious, demented, the prophets and savants, the wolf-men that the dogs yelp back at, the speechless and the shrieking, the unutterably sad and insensate, the manic, the frenzied, the furious, the raving and deluded, the lunatic fits and outpourings and the peaceful ruminations of the calf-like idiot, nonsense and inaccessible, inarticulate wisdom and cursing, All around voices, the voices of God and his angels who may or may not be fallen, may or may not be trusted. Voices and visions out of brightness on the edge of blackness, blackness beneath bright. Creatures with horns bleating, monkeys wearing man suits and monkey masks, pressing in, pressing closer. Windows speaking, grating voices, papery voices, and eyes behind the grates and paper panes. And there is a number to the panes and to the painless, to the closed and to the open. There is meaning there writ invisible on the yellow glass, the paper panes. And there is a number to the stones and the cracks. And there is an alleyway, and there is a wall, and there are doors in significant numbers, but none of them offers ingress or egress. There is no way out of this prison, this madhouse, this sepulchre, this palace, this labyrinth. No way but death and the promise of heaven, painless, and the certainty of pain or hell, or of nothing, of nothing, of nothing, of what were we speaking? The gratifying slide back into oblivion, and everything blurring again in the tears, in the colours, in the bright and darkness, in dreaming. Back within better than outside, looking on, looking in. Looking out as it expands, inevitable, inescapable. However you rend and tear at the veils, there are always others, and no true light can shine through them. They are endlessly woven and rewoven by the ceaseless spiders, hiding in the corners that the light can't reach into. The spiders that hide in the dark there and come out and creep into the corner of the eye and crawl invisible, no matter how hard, how fast you flick, and you scratch, with your bound, mittened hands rubbing light into the eyes and leaving filaments of swaddle that scratch and scratch stuck between the eyelid and the eyeball. You can feel it, a spider's leg, even when the lids are closed, coming out of the red darkness behind them. Do you know them, the shapes of them, almost, but there isn't a way to say it, and it's unspeakable, all unsayable, and only at carnival. It makes a terrible sense now. Only here in the streets, in our paint and our dances, can we be presented in public, outside, exposed, turned out from the inside. And the king is here, or something. There is some reason we're here. The flesh of the dead Christ that they have consumed, dead flesh in the mouth. Bite your tongue, they must cover their mouths if they won't close them, or suck on their hands if they must hush, or sing nicely, mustn't shout or scratch. So the city celebrates God's glory, even in these straitened times, but these surely are times of abundance. See, there is bread and wine, like a miracle flowing forth from the bounty of the Lord and the King, his anointed servant. Wine flows through the streets of El Corto. The city trips and reels and capers after the Saviour's blood and body, and the king and his cousins, cheered by the madmen in a wake of revelry, the procession ascending all the way to the unassuming gates of the new palace, which close upon the eggy chaos left behind it, and the nobles leave the populace to their sticky, stinking party just before they find out that the wine's dried up, and they can't afford more for the taxes, and there isn't any left in the city anyway.
Thank you. Wonderful. I'm going to open up to questions from the audience in a moment, but just one thing I would like to talk about before we finish, and I guess in a way, I mean, I suppose we should say spoiler alert, in as much as the story will ultimately conclude with the deaths of our protagonists. But I guess it's no surprise to anybody that a king and a painter from the 17th century passed away. But yet death hangs over the book as well, whether it be all of the children that Philip lost, whether it be this sense with the king, with the painter, but also I think with the writer when we meet her in the book. I hesitate to say you, because you have to be careful in those situations, but is this idea to leave a legacy as well about what will remain once people have passed on, and that seems to say it casts a pallor certainly over the king. And yet for Diego, you mentioned Las Meninas earlier, and in a sense it's quite an interesting one, in that this is one considered essentially his masterpiece, which came quite late in his life. I mean, often we think of artists having a sort of burst of creativity and then waning. So I just wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that sense of, I guess, of death and of legacy in the book, if that's not too general. No, well,
I think that's part of the reason I'm sort of attracted to or interested in the Baroque and that aesthetic of, on the one hand, kind of profusion and excess, and on the other hand, I think they are obsessed with this. There's this underlying sense of mortality, and the anxiety about that. And I think it's something I kind of worked out as I as I worked on the book, that this is sort of what's underpinning it, that this is what the King's obsessed with, that this is maybe why I'm interested in it. I remember having a conversation with David Miller, who is sadly no longer with us, and was working with me as an agent, and he, in a very David way, took me out for a lunch and kept buying me wine, and he was like, "But what's it about? What's it about?" Until eventually I was like, it's about death. That's what it's about. And actually that was a very helpful kind of way of crystallising that it's about time passing and what is left as time passes.
And just reflecting on Las Meninas as well, do you think that gave a sort of, in a sense, a sort of slightly different trajectory to the life of Velázquez than many other artists? I
think I was, in some ways, I debated for a long time about whether to include that first piece that I read out as that prologue, even though it was the first thing that I wrote. Because in some ways I'm quite resistant to the idea that this is the apotheosis of, this is the pinnacle of everything that he did. He worked for another 5 or 6 years afterwards. He wasn't particularly ill. He just got ill and died. So the idea that everything is building to that moment, in some ways I'm resistant to, but I think for me I wanted to place it at the beginning more because it provides a formal structure, but that idea that the viewpoint slips around a lot, I kind of wanted to establish that. But I do think that, I think he's quite constrained by the things that he was asked to do in his lifetime, that he basically is just painting portraits. So part of the reason that painting is so enigmatic and mystifying is that we don't really know where it came from.
Sure. Yeah. It's over to you. If you have a question for Amy, just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. So we'll begin with this gentleman here, then we'll jump to this lady over there.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So how do you characterize the difference in writing styles in this book as opposed to in the Still Point, which was, you had a lot of vivid descriptions of the Arctic in the Still Point. So how did you deliberately want to write in a different style for this book, or do you think the subject matter just, inspired you to write in a different way?
I think probably a bit of both. So I think both books are quite. I'm quite a sort of descriptive, quite a wordy writer. I like the third person, and I think I like the kind of fluidity and flexibility. So to some extent, the Still Point was doing something similar, although perhaps in a slightly more traditional free and direct style-y kind of way. But my second book is first person, but to me there's a stylistic similarity that continues, but I suppose there's just a maturing as I continue to write, but also surely the subject matter influences the style, and I think the kind of elaborateness of the Baroque as a period and as an aesthetic gives me a bit of license, maybe. I don't know if that answers your question. But
I can't wait to read your book. So this question is about the conversation, the voices of the king and the painter. How did you create voices of 17th century Madrileños?
That's a very good question. Mostly by avoiding rendering any dialogue as I think it's something I'm quite nervous of, the sort of one-size-fits-all historical fiction, this is how people spoke in the olden days style that is just sort of slightly formal and not really attached to any place. And one of the things that we've not really spoken about, but one of the things that I've done in the book is use quite deliberately anachronistic kind of verbal references and formulations because I don't even speak Spanish for a start, but I certainly have no real concept of how two people in the 17th century at that level of the social hierarchy would have spoken to each other. So partly there's just very little reported dialogue, but partly I've just allowed myself to not even pretend that I would know, if that makes sense.
Just as a quick sort of addendum to that, I know, for example, when people take take on, for example, Joyce, or like sort of try and fictionalize historical characters, there is a kind of body of scholars who will react in some way, sometimes positively, sometimes aggressively. And I was just wondering if there has yet been any contact with the sort of Velázquez
hasn't yet.
in the academy.
Well, not that I've allowed myself to look up. No, it's something that makes me nervous, and I think in some ways that anachronistic approach is a way of letting myself off the hook to say, well, I'm not pretending that everything is accurate. I'm acknowledging that it's artificial in some way.
And during those fairly long periods of sitting, you said there was quite a lot of dialogue. What were the kind of things that they were talking about? Can you imagine?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they were. I think to me that was partly what I thought was interesting about the King's compulsion to visit the studio, is the idea that maybe he didn't have to talk, or he didn't have to sort of behave in a particular way or perform in a particular way. He was allowed to just sit there. So I'm not sure that they did talk that much. I don't know.
Any more questions?
Shall I do it without microphone?
No, it's good for the podcast. Thank you.
Can you tell us what kind of material you found? Is there letters been written between them, or is there sort of material?
So, as I say, I'm partly hampered by the fact of not reading Spanish. The kind of primary source material that I had some access to, the King wrote a lot of letters in his life, and he wrote a lot to, there were actually particularly two religious women, two abbesses, nuns, that he wrote to, who I've kind of conflated into one. Because, I mean, this is one of the luxuries, and one of the things where I think, well, I have to describe these two people, but on the page, for the amount that they're on the page, this is a nun and this is another nun, they might as well be the same nun. But he wrote to them for advice, for kind of spiritual advice and also political advice, which I found was quite an interesting sort of element. And that there are things in the book which are drawn from this, the way that he described his daughters, the way that he described his relationship with his second wife, which did change over time. But in terms of what's recorded of the relationship between the painter and the King, there isn't a huge amount, really.
Any more questions? One that I'd just like to finish with in that case that I realise we haven't talked about is that there are actually some elements of Velázquez's work in the book.
Oh, yeah.
And this is something but you chose, rather than reproducing entire canvases, you chose to reproduce just specific details. And I'm just curious about the decision to include any of it at all. And then once you had made that decision, why specifically details rather than the entire canvases?
Yeah, so I wanted to include some visual element early on. I wanted it to be details because I think I didn't want the images to serve a sort of illustrative purpose. I didn't want there to be this kind of straightforwardly kind of ekphrastic thing of this is the painting the writing is describing and here's the painting that you can compare it against. I was kind of avoiding that. So the details, I want those details to kind of stop you and make you look and see, and I suppose a lot of the book is trying to find a way to see as he saw, so trying to make you hone in on that one thing, and to interrupt and maybe sometimes work against the text. Originally there were about 100 in there, and then I had to cut it back.
Because I thought that was, for me, it seemed a very effective way to do it as well. It evoked John Berger's ways of seeing as well, just this idea that sort of the way in which we take in an image will depend on how we're consuming it. And I think particularly today it's interesting with you know, and you mentioned in the first reading, sort of be surrounded by screens and mirrors and representations and things like that, and sort of including just details seemed to. I mean, I didn't know all of the paintings. I knew very few of them, but the ones that I did know, it seemed to, in sort of constraining them, just showing me a detail, it seemed to kind of to give new life to them.
Yeah,
in a way.
I think there's a willful obtuseness to it. The detail that is eventually included from First Menus is the dog. It's the dog. It's the most kind of obscure corner of that painting.
Well, that is all we've got time for, but at least for the formal conversational part of the evening, do stick around for a glass of wine. Amy will also be signing books. We have plenty of copies of Painted to the King at the front desk. We also have copies of The Still Point and Orkney. And earlier we were talking about the sort of progression in style, and so, you know, I wouldn't be doing my bookseller's duty if I didn't encourage you to buy all three of the books and then to compare. But really, The Painted to the King is such a wonderful read. I can't recommend it highly enough. So do buy your copies en masse, stick around for a glass of wine, and join me one more time in saying thank you to Amy Sackville.